Continue to find ourselves in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and today what we see is the reality of highs and lows in life. And then secondly, we see the two different responses that we can have to those lows when they come. First, the reality of highs and lows. So this is towards the end of chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8. You remember that Jesus had the miraculous feeding of the 5,000. Last week, if you were here, Jesus healed the deaf man and the mute man. There was things in him that were closed up that needed to be opened. So Jesus applied that very particular treatment for that man to open him up. So at this point, the vibe is good. The morale is high. We're experiencing the highs. Peter wants to get in on the highs even. Jesus asked the question, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And Peter steps up and says, you're the Christ. You're the one. Jesus receives that and affirms Peter, experiencing highs. Then the vibe changes. Jesus starts to hint at the lows. The fact that he has to head to Jerusalem now, be handed over to the scribes and Pharisees, to be tortured, to be crucified, and to be killed. It's interesting, in verse 32, it says, when Jesus was saying this, it says, Jesus spoke this openly. It's almost as just like it's matter of fact, he says, this is gonna happen. The lows are coming. Lows are a reality. The cross is coming. Suffering is coming. We all know it's just the fact of life that we've got highs and we've got lows. We've got good days and we've got bad days. The good days can be really good, and the bad days can be really bad. And really, it's more like not so much bad days, but it's like bad weeks or a season in life that we're in. That's bad, which is accompanied with pain, suffering, discomfort. And that could either be due to sin, or it's just through the ebbs and flows of life. So we know those highs and lows, the difference of what it's like for a moment we feel pretty good, we feel confident, we're at peace, and then the next moment it can be from a single mistake that we make, or it can be, like I said, through the ebbs and flows that we're in a low, and then that's accompanied, whether that's physical suffering, psychological, we're in a spot of spiritual suffering, and there's pain. Chances are there's some of us here in a low this morning. If we're not in one this morning, there will be a low coming soon. So brings us to the important to know the two different responses that we can have to the lows when the times of suffering and pain and discomfort come. And what we see in the gospel today, one response to the lows is deemed satanic, and the other response to the low is redemptive. The satanic response is Peter's first response. When Jesus is talking about the lows, he's talking about the dark times. He's talking about the suffering, the pain. He's talking about the cross. Verse 32 says, Peter took Jesus aside and rebuked him. And the Greek there that's used for rebuke, in the Greek, it gives off the idea that it's not just like this simple rebuke by Peter, but it's as if Peter is taking Jesus by the collar of the shirt and putting him up against the wall and saying, like, I'm not letting that happen. We're not going to the lows like that. I'm not going to let you go to the cross. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen under my watch. And to that, Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And he clarifies it. He says, you're thinking not as God does, but as man does. What's Peter's problem? Is that when he hears the pain, when he hears sacrifice, when he hears suffering, he immediately thinks that's gotta be wrong. I need to avoid that at all costs, the pain, the suffering, the sacrifice. Here's the deal, it's easy for us to think that way. It's easy for Peter to think that way, of course, right? Who hears about the cross? Like, it's just normal and natural to say, no, we're not going to let that happen. And if it's easy for Peter to think that way, it's especially easy for us to think that way as moderns here in the West. Because we emphasize personal happiness and comfort and the ease of life. And because of that, we often think that if we're suffering, and there's suffering in my life right now, that something's got to be wrong. Something's got to be wrong with me, or something's got to be wrong with the circumstance in my life right now. The reality is that suffering that I'm experiencing in my life doesn't necessarily mean that something's wrong. It might just be the cross that the Lord has for me right now. But if I deny it, as Peter did, deny the cross that the Lord has for me, get behind me, Satan. That's one response. The other response we hear, the redemptive response that we can have during those lows, is the next verse, verse 34. Jesus, after he rebukes Peter, he pulls his disciples in and he says, here's the path. Here's the way to go. Deny yourself and pick up your cross. Then you follow me. That is, the way of God is sacrifice. The way of God is embracing the difficult. It's embracing the lows when they come and to not flee and run from them for the cross that's in my life right now. There's a legend that Peter, right, so after all this is happening and after Jesus goes to the cross, he goes to Jerusalem, he dies on the cross, and even after he ascends into heaven, later on, Peter is in Rome. Persecution's picking up. He's in another low spot. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, and actually his own sacrifice and death is about to take place. And the legend has it is that Peter has one of those moments again. And so he leaves Rome. And as he's leaving Rome, he sees a vision of Jesus heading into Rome. And there's a church built at this spot right now in Rome. As Peter's leaving Rome, he sees Jesus walking into Rome. And when Peter sees Jesus, he says, Quo vadis, Domine? Quo vadis, which is Latin for, where are you going, Lord? And Jesus' response to Peter is this sad, I'm going to Rome to be re-crucified. See, that was enough for Peter to be like, what am I doing? Why am I fleeing from the cross? Why am I fleeing from the pain and the suffering and the sacrifice here? Whatever state in life you're in, whether you're here, you're married, priest like me. Actually, I'm the only priest. Oh no, there's 3 priests here, I think, today. Priest, you're single, you're waiting maybe for your vocation to come out, or another state in life. Quo vadis? Where are you going? Maybe especially when the heat is turned up. The heat's turned up in your marriage or in my priesthood. Where am I balking away from the sacrifice? Because when we balk away from the sacrifice, when it's painful and it's difficult, the Lord says, Quo vadis? Where are you going? Why are you fleeing it? Why are you fleeing what I've called you to right now, the cross that I've called you, the level of sacrifice in which I'm asking you to rise up to and get and hit? Because that's where you're going to meet me, at the cross. Ask yourself this morning, what am I walking away from right now that I shouldn't be walking away from? Maybe it's even in my mind. Like when I think about being at another parish, a pastor at another parish, I never think that, right? No. Or you're thinking about, you see on social media and you're playing the comparison game of like, what if it was with her or with him? Even in the mind, the Lord's saying, where are you going? Quo vadis? Where are you going? And it's especially the case when the heat is turned up. when it's gotten hard, where am I balking away from the sacrifice, from the cross? Someone put it this way with regards to the vocation. They said, every vocation is born of sacrifice, is maintained by sacrifice, and is measured by sacrifice. That's the Christian way. That's the way to fulfillment, ultimately, and to happiness. See, so that's why it's such a big problem when we shrink away from the cross in our life. We shrink away from the difficulty because it all revolves around the cross. The whole Christian life revolves around the cross. My priesthood, I've got to know, is born of sacrifice. If you're married, you got to know that your marriage is born of sacrifice. It's maintained by sacrifice. To keep my priesthood going requires sacrifice. Ongoing sacrifice. Our vocation is maintained by sacrifice. It requires the lows. It requires us engaging the pains and the low and the discomfort. And then it's measured by sacrifice. To the extent that we give of ourselves, as St. John Paul II would say, to the extent that we make of ourselves a self-gift or a self-donation, the more human we actually become. Giving of ourselves, which is incredibly difficult in the hard times. We want to flee Rome. When the heat's turned up, it's so easy for me just to leave Rome. And the Lord is always there. If we pause and listen, he's always saying, Quo Vadis? Where are you going? Life is filled with the highs and lows. When the lows come, the pain, the discomfort, the sacrifice, it seems like common sense just to flee Rome. And especially as moderns, with instant gratification, we're conditioned for the easy. We're conditioned for easy. It must be denied. We must meet the Lord up the level of sacrifice in our lives and meet him at the cross. And when we embrace the cross, when we embrace the level of sacrifice, it's where we meet him. And so therefore, we're not picking up the cross in isolation, but we're rather picking up the cross in communion. The cross is impossible to pick up and carry if we're in a spot of isolation. But no, we meet him at the cross. So we go up toward a greater degree of sacrifice, and then our life becomes alive. So rather than fleeing, we would take, and that being a satanic move, we rather take the redemptive move, which is always choosing sacrifice and choosing the cross.